All right. All right, guys. Well, we got random podcasts today. We're going to be jumping into lots of different topics today. I got a couple topics to discuss. I got a couple questions to answer. So we're going to start burning through these. So I have a question from... This was actually given February 23rd. So we missed this one. This one was asked while Tim was on the podcast. We didn't get around to getting it. So we're going to burn into it here.
That was a rough time, so forgive us.
All right. This question is from Alyssa Schutzer. Schutzer? The question is, household dogs with human resource guarding issues and tiny humans. You've mentioned before there's no reason for dogs to have access to newborns, which seems completely reasonable. But how do you prevent your dog from developing guarding with, say, your own young children who at some point are crawling and walking anywhere? I guess my question is, how do you begin to enforce boundaries to protect both dogs and tiny human? So I'm not entirely sure if this is being asked from the context of how do you stop the dog from guarding the children specifically or guarding things from the children. So I will try my best to answer it both ways here. So resource guarding in general, obviously, if you break it down at its core, it's a dog feels possessive over something of high value to them. So a lot of times we'll see this over toys, we'll see this over food, we'll see this over affection and people. And a lot of times that comes from those people being too soft to the dog and providing too much with nothing in return, right? So the dog winds up then seeing that person as simply a resource, right? It's something that provides fun things to them. So they want to defend that or protect that against other people, other dogs, anything they may perceive as a threat, right? So in the context of, I would say what most people get concerned about with children is not necessarily that the dog will be guarding things towards the children. The biggest issue that I see is that the people think that the dog is going to guard the children themselves, right? And a lot of times that comes from providing the child and having it be this kind of come up and sniff it and say hi and lay next to the crib and do all these different types of things where the dog starts to feel like that resource is something that they possess and are more likely to guard it, right? So that's why I'm so strict initially on the idea that they should have minimal access to that child initially, because we want to set that tone right away that the child is mine, not yours, right? And especially if we have a dog that has a history of guarding issues, they can quickly develop those tendencies towards people or towards dogs. So, all of this stuff, any of my answers I typically will give people are under the expectation that the dog has some degree of training already, right? Because if you don't have training, you can't really communicate anything very effectively, because we do use a lot of management techniques, like say down stays or bed stays, which are things that the dogs should need to know how to do. We need to have the training established in order to get them to do those things, right? So I can, if I take a dog that's untrained and the dog is having resource guarding issues and I say, hey, have the dog hold a 30-minute bed stay every day, then it's like, okay, cool. How do I get my dog to do that, right? So you have to get the dog trained first and foremost. And, typically the training in itself helps to alleviate 90% of the problem once you do it properly, obviously, because you get your dog into a more compliant state of mind. You get them to a point where you could start to ask things out of them when they're in these types of states of mind and hold them accountable for those things. You could discipline them for things, et cetera, right? So first step, obviously make sure you have your dog trained. Second step, immediately upon bringing the baby into the home, you want to make sure that you're having the dog hold lots of bed stays, lots of down stays. You're making sure that you're implementing procedures where you're not even really allowing the dog to come up and sniff. You're creating clear boundaries for if you're sitting on the couch feeding the baby or hanging out with the baby or whatever it may be, the dog needs to be keeping a perimeter away from you, et cetera. Just make sure you're keeping in mind that we don't want contact right now, right? And you're going to do that until your dog stops feeling so much like... until they stop feeling so much like they have to be like on guard all the time around the child, right? Or they seem a little bit less interested, or they seem like they've hit the point where they're like, okay, cool, mom and dad aren't going to let me get close to this thing right now, right? From there, little by little, you start allowing privileges and you start allowing them to develop a relationship as one, the child is old enough to understand some boundaries themselves, and two, the dog is compliant enough in the presence around the child where you can clearly manage things as they pop up. Right now, all of this is under the assumption that the dog doesn't have any issues with people, right? Because if that's the case, you got a whole other slew of things that you want to work through in the meantime to make sure that when you go to start that introduction process, you're not going to have any big issues with it, right? Okay, so next question then is under the assumption that the dog is resource guarding things to your children, right? So your dog has a toy, a bone, whatever it may be, and as your child is walking around, the dog starts to guard those things in the presence of the child, right? So this one is obviously a little bit more serious and something you want to take more strictly. First step remains the same as the first side of the equation, right? No contact, making sure your dog is becoming neutralized to just having the child around, period, right? Because a lot of these guarding tendencies and stuff come from the dog being unsure of the person, the dog, whatever it may be, right? So you want to make sure that you're working through that. You want to make sure that you're doing all of your training related things, all of your maintenance related things. From there, you want to make sure that you're eliminating the resources first of all, right? So we're making sure food, toys, affection, none of it is laying around. You're still making sure the dog has minimal free time around the child. You're making sure that you're implementing a muzzle anytime the dog is out around the child if you're really that concerned that there's going to be a bite. But a lot of the resource guarding issues come from mutual respect, right? So that means that I'm not going to allow contact until the child can understand those boundaries with the dog still. That means that I need to make sure that the child understands they need to keep a perimeter around Fido or whoever it may be. We need to make sure that the dog is also keeping a perimeter around the child and they're learning to respect each other's space. Little by little, as trust starts to be developed, you start implementing the resources back into the mix. That means, if you've been feeding separate for the first 2 years of the child's life or year of the child's life or whatever it may be, that means that you little by little start allowing the dog to be fed, maybe not in the crate, but even then making sure the child is not in the space. And you just manage the situation as you need to, right? There's no magic solution to this kind of stuff. It just comes from being overly proactive about things, right? And that's actually like wrapping this into both of them together. Dogs and children, resource guarding issues, any of that kind of stuff. As long as you are always being overly proactive as opposed to giving too much trust to the dog too soon, 9 out of 10 times you're not going to see a lot of issues. A lot of people just go into these situations just like, fingers crossed, I'm not going to do anything, but I'm just going to hope that it goes well, right? Or fingers crossed, I'm just going to allow them to kind of figure it out with each other when it comes to the dogs and the children or the guests and the dog or whatever it may be. And they run into issues because they're just setting themselves up for failure. They're not doing anything to mitigate the situation. Where to this day, if I have guests come over my house or if I have one of my dogs and I take them to my parents' house while there's going to be young children there or something because my mom runs a child daycare service out of her house, I am always going the absolute extreme end of the spectrum where even though my dogs are great with children, I'm making sure that I'm making them hold downstays for the first, half hour that they're there. I'm making sure if the kids want to come over and pet the dog that I'm putting structure to it and I'm managing how it's being done and I'm making sure that I'm ready to correct my dogs if they were to say jump or paw or do anything like that. And I'm always being prepared for these things so that I don't run into issues because of it. So that's the key with this is don't ever get too comfortable too quick, right? Like, bringing a baby into the house or a child or whatever it may be, when you have a dog, like that's a huge undertaking and that's something you have to take seriously no matter how good your dog is. And you have to understand that the dog's life is going to be changing for a long time as you introduce this child into your home, right? That doesn't just mean the first month, which I feel like a lot of people look so short term with this stuff. Yeah. That may mean the first 2 years until the dog is walking and talking, your dog's routines are changing, right? And you got to be okay with that, and you got to be prepared to accept that, because I think that's why a lot of people will get rid of dogs when they have children, or they try to, a month before they have the child, ship their dog off to a board and train or something, because they don't do the pre-planning and understanding how big of a deal some of this stuff is going to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel like sometimes people, for lack of a better word, maybe even force the interactions sometimes?
Yeah.
They're like, "Oh, come here, come here, Fido," like, and try to force this interaction.
I think that comes from, like we were just talking, I think it comes from people wanting this to be a short-term game.
Yeah.
Right? No different than, it's funny, we were talking with Michelle last podcast about how it gets so easy to get like jaded and like judgmental towards like clients and stuff like that, or towards like behavioral issues. And here's the thing, every single dog trainer in the history of dog trainers is guilty of this, right? But so when I was in Joshua Tree, I saw a interaction going down in one of the stores where some lady had this like shepherd husky mix thing, right?
Okay.
And this guy had this like little wiener dog, right? And I just saw, the guy was like wanting to like get his little wiener dog to like meet this dog, right? And you could tell the dog wanted nothing to do with it. Every time he would get close, the dog would like hide between his legs, and it got as far as like, as opposed to looking at that situation and first off being like, okay, cool, let's just not do the on-leash greetings, right?
Yeah.
Because it's just not a good idea. But whatever. People that are, say, uneducated to why that's important, right? You see something like that, and why can't we just look at it and say, this dog clearly doesn't want to interact with this dog right now.
Yeah.
He wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't aggressing or growling or doing anything. He's just like, nah, I'm going to go the other way, right? I don't want to meet this dog right now. But instead of just looking at that and looking at the obvious of, it's so simple. He doesn't want to meet him. We're just going to go the other way.
Yeah.
Oh, well, cool. Not a big deal. Nice to meet you. Bye, right? Instead of that, it went as far as this guy got on the ground. He picked up the dog and kept repeatedly setting it like 2 feet closer to this other thing, trying. And every time he did that, the dog just ran right back to him, and he kept trying. And then he tried the, I'm going to hold you in one spot and then try to get this other dog to sniff my hand and get the dog to come closer to, and it just like, it turned into this production, of just like, this dog, you guys have to like each other right now.
Yeah.
You have to sniff each other right now.
Yeah.
Right. And it just turned into that. And it's like, come on. Like this is why we have problems.
Yeah.
Right. Because we can't look at the obvious situation and look at and be empathetic to the fact that like, he just doesn't want it right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
We even see it with treats. I've seen so many times people try to give their dog a treat and say like a lesson or something, and the dog doesn't want the treat. And instead they sit there and they just try to like, come on, you need to want this treat right now. Right. You have to take it right now because in my mind, it's going to make you happy if you take this treat. So you have to take it right now. And you have to be happy right now. Right. And we just try to force these things on the dog as opposed to just like understand that sometimes dogs get in states of mind. And we're getting on a tangent here right now. This is kind of, I'll divert this back in a minute. But, as opposed to sometimes dogs get in a state of mind where they get overwhelmed by something or they get uncomfortable by something, and they need to just like be able to internalize and process those emotions and figure out exactly what it is that they're feeling and exactly why they're feeling it. And it's our job at that point to let them do it and give them just very clear information to help guide them through the correct choices, right? Because that's the key. The key is not that we don't make the dog scared, or the key is not that the dog has to be happy all the time, or that the dog is never going to experience, sadness or whatever, anything like that. The key is that training allows us to, when the dog feels those emotions that they don't understand, the training allows us to be able to coach them through the appropriate responses to those things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't think people understand / realize that, Yeah. And it's just insane when I see stuff like that. So going back to the dogs and the babies, is we look at this as, I need to socialize my dog, and I need to make sure that over the course of 2 minutes, my dog is good with this thing, right? In our mind, that interaction on the street between the two dogs, this should be a positive. My dog has developed a new relationship with another dog.
Yeah.
We bring the baby into the house. My dog has developed a relationship with the new baby right now. We have an aggressive dog and we bring a guest into the house, right? Boom. My dog should be able to socialize and develop a relationship with this person, as opposed to understanding how much time that develops. Or how much time that takes, I should say, right? We've talked about this before from the context of us out on the street, the quick interaction at Starbucks of saying hi to some person. Does that mean we're socialized and best friends with that person? No. Versus our coworkers that we've worked with for the last 2 years that, after a year and a half of working with them, one of them invites you out to go get drinks after, and then you start to develop that relationship, right? It takes time, and it's okay that it takes time for that, right?
Exactly.
And we have to, we love humanizing things with dogs, obviously. We have to understand that you can look at those things kind of humanizing, right? And if you do it, it's going to give you a better understanding of things as a whole, I think. Yeah. Right?
I believe that.
So I don't know. That's what I see the most, right? Is, and where your dog starts at just determines how long that process is going to take. It doesn't determine if it's possible or not, because I think any of these dogs can develop a relationship. And here's the thing, in the case of a baby or a young child or whatever, right? Again, I don't have a whole ton of context as far as how they're asking this question, but I've never, the process can be quicker in those cases because they don't go away, right? If your dog is living in the house with that child or that person or whatever it may be, they're going to more quickly develop the relationship. But you still have to understand that no matter where the dog's at on the spectrum, that just determines how much time it's going to take. If they're over here and they're really, really bad, right? Then they have to go all the way from here to like, I'm just neutral to then I have a relationship, where if they just start neutral, it's going to be less time, right? So, that's question number one.